They didn't see a veteran. They saw a man standing too straight for his age, wearing a jacket too old for the season and a cap too faded to matter. At gate 17, under flickering fluorescent lights and the dull groan of rolling suitcases, one agent whispered to another, "Looks like someone wandered off from a retirement tour," just loud enough to be heard. He didn't flinch. He didn't correct them. He only stood quietly, holding a weathered boarding pass between fingers that still bore the rigid calm of a man who used to count seconds between detonations. His name was Carl Jefferson, 79 years old, Army combat engineer, 2 tours nobody asked about, free medals nobody ever saw. And inside the worn duffel slung over his shoulder, beneath a shaving kit and a folded paperback, lay a creased letter signed by General Harlow himself. But none of that mattered now. Not to the agent behind the counter, Sandra Keene, who barely glanced up before shaking her head and snapping, "Sir, this isn't a valid pass." Carl, as always, answered softly, "It's from the Legacy program. Confirmed yesterday by the help desk." Sandra frowned like she'd been personally inconvenienced, held it up to the light, and then, without another word, fed it straight into the shredder beside her keyboard. The sound was mechanical and cruel, and it echoed loud enough to turn 1 or 2 heads. Carl didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for a supervisor. He only reached down, adjusted the strap of his bag, and stepped aside so the next passenger could move forward without delay. If you agree that no veteran, no matter how quiet or forgotten, deserves to have his dignity shredded with his ticket, then like and subscribe, because this story is not over. 10 feet away, Aiden Shun, a college intern shadowing the terminal team, stared with wide eyes, frozen somewhere between shock and anger. He didn't know the man's name yet, but he had seen the patch on his duffel. 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne. His own uncle had worn the same. He slipped out his phone and snapped a discreet photo of the shredded ticket's remnants, still curling like confetti in the tray, and of the old man now seated beside a charging station, carefully unfolding a napkin around a sandwich he'd packed himself. Aiden's fingers moved fast as he typed an email and forwarded the photo to the last person on the chain of command he ever expected to see it, Helena Voss, CEO of the Airline, former Air Force herself, and a woman whose inbox usually filtered everything below VP level. But today, that filter broke. At 7:41 a.m., somewhere high above a different airport, Helena opened the message on her private tablet. It took her 4 seconds to process the image, 2 more to recognize the patch, and exactly 7 to remember where she'd seen that name before. Carl Jefferson wasn't just a vet. He was the man who had pulled her pilot out of a burning wreck in Kandahar. She had written his name in a journal once. Now it was coming back with static clarity. Meanwhile, at the gate, Sandra continued her shift unbothered. Carl sat where she'd left him, staring out the window as planes taxied into position like metal titans lining up for launch. His posture never slumped. His eyes never drifted. Even now, in the face of casual cruelty, he held the stillness of someone who had watched a lot worse unfold without ever losing his center. Aiden sat beside him eventually. "Sir," he said, unsure of what to even ask. Carl just smiled faintly. "Don't worry about it, son. I've sat through longer delays than this." And then he pulled out a small notebook, thin, leather-bound, the kind that's seen sand and storms, and began to write something down. Aiden leaned back and said nothing, but his phone buzzed. 3 words from Helena Voss. Don't let him leave. The story was beginning to move faster than any of them expected. And Carl? He simply turned the page and kept writing, calm as ever, unaware that in 20 minutes, the terminal would come to a standstill. The intercom would crackle with an unexpected announcement, and the woman whose signature lay folded inside his bag would be walking straight toward him in full dress blues. The terminal kept buzzing, of course, it always does. Flights were announced. Overpriced coffees poured. Children clutched stuffed animals by gates that opened too late or too early. And yet gate 17 had started to shift. Not loudly, not obviously, but something subtle curled through the air like static in the throat. Because word travels fastest when it's not supposed to. Someone had heard what Sandra did, what she said, and someone else had seen the pieces of the shredded pass, curling in the bin beside her desk like little ribbons of dismissal. Carl Jefferson hadn't moved much. He sat in the same chair by the charging station, his notebook open, writing in the exacting hand of a man trained to document without drama. His sandwich was gone, folded paper tucked neatly into his bag again, and in its place he now held a silver pen, not expensive, just clean, etched faintly with "From Harlow, 1973. Aiden watched it all quietly, the intern who wasn't supposed to matter. But he did, because he was the only one who'd asked who Carl was, the only one who saw beyond the khakis and the cane. He hadn't just seen a man being disrespected. He'd seen his own uncle's uniform in Carl's duffel patch, and in that quiet calm, the same look his grandfather wore when nobody listened, but he still stood anyway. And now Aiden's phone buzzed again. A new message. 2 words, 10 minutes. Sent by Helena Voss herself. Aiden's stomach flipped. He looked toward the escalator just as a woman in a sharp navy coat began to descend, flanked by no security, no camera crew, no entourage. Helena Voss didn't need an audience. She was the moment. Silver hair in a short tactical cut, a single ribbon bar pinned beneath her collar, and eyes that had seen war, seen fire through cockpit glass, and stood beside flag-draped caskets without blinking. She walked through the terminal like she owned time. And when she reached the podium at gate 17, she didn't speak to the crowd. She just turned to Sandra. "Where is he?" she asked. And Sandra, still smug, still irritated, replied, "If you mean the old man who tried to use a fake pass, he's over there, wasting time." Her voice was a little too loud, a little too proud. Helena looked at her for 3 seconds. Just 3. "You shredded the name Carl Jefferson?" she asked, flat and razor clean. "Yes. Should I have Googled him first?" Sandra shot back, arms crossed, smirking. He didn't even have a working phone number on file. And then Helena leaned in slightly. "He didn't need one," she said, "because I already knew exactly who he was." And then she walked past Sandra without another word, headed straight for Carl, who by now had noticed the growing silence around him. He looked up as Helena Voss approached, not surprised, not rattled, just observant. "Colonel," he said simply, standing slowly with that same deliberate grace. She saluted him first. "I'm not a colonel anymore, sir," she said, "but you always outrank the rest of us." He smiled faintly. "Helena Voss, I figured it might be you. Still carry the pen?" she asked, and he held it up. Every day since Harlow signed it. The passengers around them had gone silent, like someone had hit mute across the terminal. Phones were lowered. Voices hushed. Even children paused in curiosity. Helena turned to face the gate counter and raised her voice just enough to carry. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Helena Voss, CEO of this airline and a retired officer in the United States Air Force. And this man right here, Carl Jefferson, is the reason I'm standing here today." She gestured to the duffel. "He's the one who carried my pilot out of a fire zone in Kandahar when the rest of the world had written her off. He built the safe corridor we still use for extractions today. And yesterday, someone here shredded his boarding pass. Not for protocol, not for security, but because they didn't recognize the weight of service that doesn't speak loud." Sandra turned pale, but said nothing. Carl tried to interject. "It's all right," he started. Helena shook her head gently. "No, sir. You stayed silent long enough. But we won't." She turned back to the counter and motioned to a nearby agent. "Reissue his boarding pass. First class. Flight of his choosing. And send one to his daughter in Charlotte while you're at it." Then, without turning back, she added, "Also, effective immediately, Agent Keene is suspended pending review." The silence cracked like glass. Some people clapped. Others stood up without knowing why, drawn by instinct. The same way a unit rises when a commander walks in. Carl looked down, exhaled slowly, and shook his head with that same small, measured smile. "All this for a piece of paper," he said quietly. "Not for the paper," Helena replied. "For the man they thought they could shred with it." And then, in a rare gesture that no one forgot, Helena stepped aside, not leading, not guiding, just walking beside him as he made his way back to the gate. The agent there handed over the new ticket with both hands, eyes lowered. Carl took it, nodded politely, and for the first time that morning, sat in a seat with a backrest and no shadow on it. Aiden watched it all, eyes wet but smiling. Helena turned to him as she walked past. "You saved this moment," she said. "Never forget what happens when you ask who someone really is before dismissing their worth." The terminal returned to motion slowly. But now, when people looked at Carl, they didn't see a man waiting for a flight. They saw someone time had tried to forget, but failed. And somewhere inside that creased duffel, beneath the notebook and the pen and the letter from a general, was a story that had finally taken off. For a man who never asked for recognition, Carl Jefferson stood at the center of more attention than any general ever summoned at that gate. As his name echoed over the intercom, "Passenger Carl Jefferson, please proceed to gate 17." The entire terminal seemed to freeze in time. Not by order, not by force, but by something quieter and heavier. Respect. Carl walked slowly, methodically, his cane ticking lightly against the tile floor in a rhythm no one had noticed before. Steady, patient, unhurried. Helena Voss waited beside the counter, her arms at ease behind her back, flanked now by two additional airline executives who had rushed down from upper offices when word spread. But she didn't speak yet. No one did. Not even the toddlers usually screaming near the power outlets. Carl stepped up to the podium, where the same boarding gate that had once chewed his name into confetti now blinked with a newly printed pass. First class, seat 1A, direct to Charlotte. But Helena didn't hand it to him right away. Instead, she turned toward the crowd and lifted a simple folder. Thin, military gray, lined in silver edges. "This," she said, "is a personnel file marked decommissioned, 1973. Inside are after-action reports, award citations, and a letter of commendation from the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, signed by General Harlow after a rescue op that never made the news because Carl Jefferson never asked it to." She turned to face him. "Carl, your boarding pass wasn't the first thing they tried to erase, but it will be the last." And then, without instruction, it began. One by one, gate agents who had once ignored him rose to attention. A TSA officer, noticing the shift, quietly saluted from across the hallway. And slowly, awkwardly at first, passengers began to stand. A group of high school students headed for a track meet stood up and placed their hands over their hearts. A businessman removed his AirPods and simply nodded, eyes misting. And Aiden, standing by the charging station where it all began, raised his phone, not to record, but to call his mother and whisper, "You won't believe who I met today." Helena stepped aside as the flight crew emerged. Captain, first officer, and two attendants, all in full dress. The captain, himself a former Navy pilot, said nothing. He only extended a hand. Carl shook it with calm precision, then gently tucked the new boarding pass into the inside pocket of his jacket, alongside the one thing he always carried, the faded envelope containing his daughter's last handwritten letter from deployment, dated 1971. "Sir," said the flight attendant softly, "would you like help boarding?" Carl smiled faintly. "Ma'am, I've made it up rougher ramps with worse knees. I'll be just fine." As he stepped down the jet bridge, something beautiful happened. Helena Voss saluted again, one final time, and the sound of every passenger behind him standing in reverent silence filled the terminal like a hymn without words. The gate door closed gently behind him. But the story didn't end there. 10 minutes later, the airline posted a notice to its official site. "We stand corrected. We stand grateful." Carl Jefferson's boarding pass was never just paper, it was earned. The image attached was of Carl walking toward the plane, the hem of his jacket catching the light just enough to show the edge of his unit insignia. 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne. Back inside the terminal, Sandra Keene quietly packed up her belongings as she was escorted from the gate. Not shamed, not shouted at, just made irrelevant. Her smirk was gone, replaced by something worse. A silence she couldn't argue with. Aiden was offered a full-time mentorship on the spot. "You asked who he was," Helena told him. "Never stop doing that." And that's when the ripple turned to a wave. News broke within hours. Not because Carl posted anything, not because Helena bragged, but because a single passenger wrote a thread that started. "I just watched a forgotten man walk like a general through a sea of people who finally saw him. And I can't stop crying." Within a day, the thread reached 2 million likes. Veterans began tagging their own stories. A few posted photos of Carl from the 70s, some black and white, some blurred, but all carrying the same haunted stillness in his eyes. 2 weeks later, a policy was passed. All legacy military transport benefits, regardless of paper format, would be digitally honored and cross-verified, not shredded. And tucked into the carrier's next employee manual, under respect protocol, was a single story titled The Day the Gates Stood Still. As for Carl, he never brought up what happened. Not to the flight crew, not to his daughter when he landed, not to the Uber driver who carried his bag like it was sacred. But if you looked closely, you might have seen that he tucked that new boarding pass into the same pocket as the old one, reconstructed from the scraps Helena had gathered with her own hands. On the back of it, someone had written 6 words in black ink. You didn't need rank to rise. And to this day, somewhere on a quiet morning flight from Charlotte to anywhere, there might still be an old man in seat 1A, sipping black coffee, eyes on the clouds, silent, steady, and finally seen.